Tom Bilyeu is one of the sharpest analytical minds in this space. He reads data well, he sees patterns, and he genuinely wants people to win. I agree with him on a lot of things. However, this time, with his recent video on AI and jobs displacement, I think he got it wrong. The diagnosis is way off, and a wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong treatment. He opens with the job numbers that the BLS revised down by 1 million jobs, a 70% miss in 2025 alone. Recession-level numbers that nobody in the government is willing to call a recession. He's right, an alarm is justified. Something is genuinely wrong, and the people who are supposed to tell you about it are lying to your face. But before we go any further, I need to recalibrate something. Because the job numbers are not the actual metric that matters. They never were. Employment is a means to an end. The end should be prosperity. Whether you can afford to live, whether your labor buys you shelter, food, security, a future, whether the value you produce comes back to you in the form of a life worth living. In a genuinely free market, when technology makes production more efficient, those gains flow to you as lower prices. Your wages might shift, your industry might change, but your purchasing power, what your labor actually buys you, rises automatically because as technology advances, competition forces producers to pass savings along. Adjustments brought on by those advancements are real, and they can be uncomfortable. But it isn't the catastrophe Tom's describing. It isn't 40 to 80 years of generational suffering. The only way displacement stretches across generations is if something is standing between you and the efficiency gains, intercepting them before they reach you. And that something is not the technology. Tom is alarmed by the job numbers. He concludes the culprit is AI and technological displacement. If the American economy is the patient, Tom is the doctor who sees the bad rhythm on the printout and reaches for the medication. The data is real and alarm is justified. But a good doctor doesn't treat the printout. He asks, what's upstream of it? So let's do that work. What's upstream of these job numbers is more specific, more identifiable, and more correctable than Tom's diagnosis suggests. Tom keeps circling something. Through every historic example, through every pattern he traces, through every political analysis, he calls it the system. He calls it the capital class. He calls it lying politicians. He's not wrong about any of that. He just hasn't isolated the cause. So let's isolate it. Here's how the differential is going to work. We have a patient presenting with symptoms, manipulated job numbers, hollowed out cognitive work, wage stagnation, the K-shape Tom identified. Tom's diagnosis is technological displacement. We're going to test that diagnosis the way an honest clinician would, by walking through the case history. If technology is the cause, then every time technology has advanced, ordinary people should have suffered for generations. That's the testable claim. Let's see if it survives the evidence. Tom points to the angst pause as proof that technology destroys ordinary people. Let's look at what was actually happening in Britain during that period. Yes, GDP was rising. Yes, real wages were falling. But Britain during the angst pause wasn't a free market. The Corn Laws were a tariff regime designed to keep grain prices artificially high, and they were the largest single intervention in the daily lives of working-class Britons. Here's what was actually happening. The Industrial Revolution was pulling labor off the land and into the cities. The migration was a market signal. Opportunity in the cities was real, and people were responding to it. But that signal was a problem for the landed aristocracy. Their entire economic model depended on cheap agricultural labor. They couldn't compete with the cities on merit. They couldn't offer what the factories were offering. So they did what powerful interests do when the market moves against them. They went to Parliament. The Corn Laws artificially kept grain prices high, not because of market forces, but because landed aristocrats had captured the legislature and used it to slow the transition they were losing. A working family was spending half its wages just on food. Not because technology failed them, because the people the market was leaving behind used the state to make sure everyone else felt it. The people who correctly diagnosed this weren't the progressive reformers. They were the free traders. Richard Cobden and John Bright of the Manchester School were saying it plainly. The Corn Laws are the cause. Remove them and ordinary people will prosper. They were right. When the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, living standards began to improve. A specific government-created obstruction was removed, and the market did what markets do. Tom's narrative flips that causation. He sees suffering during a period of technological change and concludes the technology caused the suffering. But the free traders at the time saw it clearly. The intervention caused the suffering. The technology was the opportunity. And when the landed class lost its grip on Parliament, the transition the market had been trying to make was finally allowed to happen. That's the first piece of evidence. Suffering during a technological change, caused by the people the change threatened, using the state to slow it down. Now we run the control case. In medicine, when you want to know whether exposure, in this case technology, is causing a disease, you find another person with the same exposure. If one got sick and the other didn't, the exposure isn't the cause. You look for what was different. So let's find a different patient. Same era, same technology, different outcomes. In 1920, the United States entered one of the sharpest economic contractions in its history. Unemployment jumped from 4% to nearly 12%. Industrial production collapsed by nearly a third. Commodity prices fell 40%. By every measure, this should have become the Great Depression 10 years early. It didn't, because Warren Harding did something almost no president before or since has been willing to do. He ignored every call to intervene. His Commerce Secretary, Herbert Hoover, urged him to spend, stimulate, prop up wages, do something. Harding said no. He cut the federal budget nearly in half. He let prices fall. He let wages adjust. He got out of the way and let the market clear. By August 1921, 18 months after the crisis began, recovery was already underway. By 1923, manufacturing production had risen 48%, and unemployment had fallen by 2.4%. Not because of reform, because the body was allowed to mend without further exacerbating the trauma. Then Hoover became president, and when the next crisis hit in 1929, he did everything Harding had refused to do. He intervened. He propped up wages. He signed Smoot-Hawley. He handed a bad recession what it needed to become the Great Depression. FDR then doubled down with a New Deal. More intervention layered on top of intervention, and what should have been a sharp 2-year correction became a decade of mass suffering. Tom uses the Great Depression as evidence that technology causes displacement that destroys people for generations. But the 1920 Depression resolved in 18 months because the government stepped back and let markets clear. Same era, same technology, different outcome. That's the isolated variable. It wasn't the technology. It was whether the state was allowed to intervene. That's the second piece of evidence, and it's the control case. Whatever's making the patient sick, it isn't the technology. Before we go further, I need to stop on something. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't theory. It isn't ideology. It's documented institutional fraud. Confirmed from the institution's own records over a century after the fact. In 1914, Britain needed to finance a war. The government floated a massive war bond. It failed. The public didn't buy it. Rather than admit the failure, rather than tell the truth about what the war was actually costing and what the actual public support for it was, 2 Bank of England employees secretly purchased the unsold bonds in their own names. They didn't use their own money, though. The money was created for that purpose. The bond market said no. The printing press said yes. They then reclassified the bonds on the balance sheet to hide what had happened. The chief cashier later swore under oath that all the bonds had been sold to the public. It was a lie. John Maynard Keynes, working inside the Treasury at the time, called it in a private memo a masterly manipulation. The documents proving all this sat in the Bank of England's own archives for over 100 years. They were found in 2017. That fraud kept Britain in the war and buried a debt that would fester for a century. After the war, Britain tried to return to the gold standard, but the pound couldn't hold its value. The hidden debt had done its damage. Gold was flowing out of England and into the United States. So the Bank of England Governor Montague Norman did what powerful institutions do when they've created a problem too large to admit. He exported it. Norman secretly lobbied Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, to inflate the U.S. money supply. The logic was simple. Debase the American currency, weaken the dollar relative to the pound, stop the gold flow, cover Britain's century-defining mistake on America's balance sheet. Strong complied. From the moment the Fed opened its doors in 1914 to January 1920, total bank deposits in the United States more than doubled. That flood of artificial credit created the boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, the stock market surge, the real estate explosion. All of it built on a foundation that never really existed. And as we already saw, when that foundation cracked in 1920, Harding got out of the way and the market cleared in 18 months. But the Fed didn't learn its lesson. It went right back to inflating. Strong kept the credit expansion going through the mid-1920s, still partially propping up the Bank of England's position. The boom of the 1920s wasn't organic prosperity. It was a second bubble built on the same artificial foundation as the first. When Strong died in 1928, the expansion ended. The bubble collapsed in 1929, and this time, instead of Harding, America got Hoover, who did everything Harding had refused to do. Then Roosevelt doubled down. The National Industrial Recovery Act made it illegal for businesses to undercut their competitors. The state fixed wages and prices across hundreds of industries. In April of 1934, a New Jersey tailor named Jacob Maged was fined $100 and sentenced to 30 days in jail for charging 35 cents to press a suit when the NRA code mandated 40. The Supreme Court struck the law down in 1935, but by then the damage was done. Wages and prices that needed to fall to clear the correction were held artificially high by federal law. The market couldn't do its work because the law had made the work illegal. That is one of hundreds of interventions the state made during the New Deal. The body wasn't allowed to mend for a decade. Here's the straight line. A fraud committed in London in 1914 to hide the true cost of an unpopular war eventually broke the monetary system of the entire Western world. The correction that should have happened was delayed, exported, reinflated, and finally turned into a Great Depression by governments too compromised to let the market clear what they had broken. Some historians draw a line between World War I and World War II, and then another between the post-war era and today. But in monetary terms, there's really only one line. The money got broken in 1914 and has never been honestly fixed. Every crisis since, the Depression, the collapse of Bretton Woods, Nixon closing the gold window in 1971, 2008, the K-shape you're living in right now, is compounding interest on that original act of institutional deception. Our descendants will look back at this entire era, not as separate crises with separate causes, but as one long, painful lesson in what happens when the money supply has an infection that is never excised. Tom looks at the Great Depression and says this is what happens when technology disrupts ordinary people. But it wasn't technology that caused it. It was a fraud committed in London. And the decade of suffering that followed was a consequence of the interventions made in the name of solving a problem the interventions had caused. That's not technology. That's the pathogen. And it entered the bloodstream in 1914. That's the third piece of evidence. And it's not just a symptom. It's the mechanism of infection. Documented, dated, traceable. Every monetary crisis since is downstream of that single act. The disease has a date of onset, 1914. Now, Tom makes a point about what eventually brought ordinary people into prosperity after these painful transitions. He credits the reforms, the labor laws, the factory acts, the New Deal, the GI Bill. His argument is that governments eventually stepped in and fixed what the market couldn't. But there's a problem with that narrative, and the evidence that destroys it is sitting right inside Tom's own argument. Tom talks about the migration from farms to cities during the Industrial Revolution as if it were a downgrade. Millions of people displaced from agricultural work, flooding into urban centers looking for opportunity. He frames it as evidence of how brutal the transition was. And it was disruptive, no question. But look at what was actually happening. Those people moved voluntarily toward opportunity without being told to, without a government program directing them, without a safety net catching them. The market was signaling there is work here, there is opportunity here, and people responded to that signal the way free people do. They went where the opportunity was. That's the market working, not failing, working. Voluntary movement isn't just movement without coercion. It's movement toward something better. Every person who left a farm for a factory was making a comparison. The unreformed urban market, for all its disruption, was offering them a life they judged to be better than the one they were leaving. Millions of people running that calculation, reaching the same conclusion. And then look what happened across the Atlantic at the same time. Think about why millions of people left everything they knew in Europe and flooded into the United States during the late 1800s and 1900s. It wasn't because America had the best welfare programs. It wasn't because the government had the most generous safety nets. America at that point had virtually no safety nets at all. There was no Social Security, no unemployment insurance, no minimum wage, no federally mandated labor protections. People came because the market was open, because you could show up with nothing and build something, because prices were low enough and opportunity was real enough that your labor had genuine purchasing power. Tom has actually made this argument himself in other contexts. People didn't immigrate to America for the reforms. The reforms didn't exist yet. They came for the free market. Millions of people voting with their feet for the system without the interventions Tom credits with saving everyone. That's your counter evidence. Two massive waves of voluntary human movement, farm to city domestically, continent to continent internationally, both driven by market signals, both happening before the progressive reforms existed, and both demonstrating exactly what free markets do when they're left alone. They pull people toward opportunity. They reward productive work. They clear displacements faster than any government program ever could. The intervention is what takes that process, which should be uncomfortable but brief, and stretches it across generations. Every time the market tries to clear a distortion, the same pattern repeats. The state intervenes, props something up, and prevents the correction from completing. And then it takes credit when the things eventually improve anyway, pointing to the reforms as the cure rather than admitting they were part of the disease. Think about what an immunosuppressant does. It doesn't cure a disease. It stops the body from fighting it. The patient looks calmer, the visible symptoms recede. And underneath, the disease keeps spreading because the mechanism that was supposed to clear it has been switched off. That's what intervention does to a market correction. It suppresses the symptoms while the underlying distortion compounds. Consider one example. In 1933, with millions of Americans hungry, the Roosevelt administration paid farmers to plow under crops and slaughter 6 million piglets and pregnant sows that would never go to market. The official theory was that low farm prices were the problem and destroying supply would fix it. People stood in bread lines while the federal government destroyed food. That's not a caricature. That's the Agricultural Adjustment Act, signed into law and executed as policy. The disease was the prior intervention, the credit expansion, the wage controls, the mercantilist trade structure. What the state prescribed was more intervention layered on top, suppressing the body's ability to clear the distortion. Then, when the patient finally collapsed, the people who prescribed the intervention pointed at the collapse and said, "See, we need even more." That's the fourth piece of evidence. The reforms didn't cure the patient. They suppressed the body's ability to heal itself and called the suppression a cure. That pattern doesn't stop in 1933. The same disease keeps producing the same symptoms. Let's look at the patient today. Tom is right that the job numbers are being manipulated. He's right that cognitive work is being hollowed out. He's right that the political system is fracturing along predictable lines. He's right that neither side is telling you the truth. Tom shows you the K-shape. He says it means the population is permanently splitting. That technology, in this case AI, will accelerate the divide. That's not what it means. The K-shape isn't the story. It's the readout. It's what the patient looks like right now. The current presentation of a disease we've been tracing the whole time. And if you want to actually help the patient, you don't treat the readout, you treat what's causing it. Here's the question Tom doesn't ask. If AI is creating a massive wave of productivity, and it is, where are the gains going? In a free market, the answer is straightforward. Competition drives producers to pass efficiency gains to consumers through lower prices. Your cost of living falls. Your purchasing power rises. The technology makes you richer automatically. Not because a politician decided to redistribute anything, but because that's what competition does when it's allowed to operate. That's not what's happening. And it's not what's happening for a very specific reason. The currency is being debased in real time, eroding every dollar of productivity AI generates before it reaches you. The regulatory structure is protecting incumbent corporations from the competition that would force them to pass savings along. The barriers to entry the state has built around every major industry, finance, healthcare, housing, energy, ensure that efficiency gains stay at the top of the pyramid instead of flowing down through price competition to ordinary people. Here's the part that takes a minute to see clearly, because it's not how most people think about corporate behavior. Imagine two versions of a company that just got access to AI. Both versions can use it the same way, to make every employee more productive, expand what the company can offer, and how cheaply it can offer it. Or to replace the employees outright, capturing the labor savings as profit. In the first version, the company faces real competition. New entrants can show up at any time. If that company doesn't pass productivity gains to customers as lower prices or better products, a competitor will. Under those conditions, the rational use of AI is augmentation. Make your people more productive, lower your prices, expand your offering. Outrun the competition by serving the customer better. Labor stays employed because labor is the lever that makes the productivity gain reach the customer. In the second version, the company is protected. Regulatory moats keep new entrants out. The customer has nowhere else to go. There are compliance costs that the incumbent can absorb, but the startup can't. Licensing requirements that take years to satisfy. Capital requirements that lock the market to existing players. Under those conditions, the rational use of AI changes completely. Augmentation doesn't help. There's no competitor to outrun. Lowering prices doesn't help. The customer is captive. The only way AI improves the company's position is by cutting the labor costs and capturing the savings as margin. Replacement isn't a strategic choice. It's the only move that makes financial sense in a protected market. That's the mechanism. Competition focuses corporate energy on productivity that reaches the customer. Barriers to entry focus corporate energy on maintaining margins by squeezing labor. Same technology, two completely different outcomes, determined entirely by which incentive structure the company is operating inside of. The displacement Tom is alarmed about isn't AI's fault. It's the predictable behavior of protected companies using AI in line with the incentive structure brought on by protectionism. That's the fifth piece of evidence. The K-shape isn't a market outcome. It's the result of a system that intercepts productivity before it reaches you and routes it to whoever wrote the rules. Now here's where Tom's political analysis falls short. He sees the right's narrative clearly enough, that it purports to be free market. He just thinks they execute that principle badly. Imperfect people running good ideas. That's half right. The execution is corrupt. But what's being executed isn't a free market framework that got captured. The right doesn't actually let the market rip. The right lets mercantilism rip. Corporate subsidies, government contracts, regulatory moats that protect incumbents from competition, trade deals that benefit connected industries, and yes, tariffs. That's not a free market. That's mercantilism with a liberty bumper sticker. And the left's regulations don't protect workers. They protect the regulatory infrastructure that captured industries use to keep competitors out. Consider what these regulations actually look like in practice. In a majority of states, braiding hair without a cosmetology license is illegal. The license requires over 1,000 hours of training. That has nothing to do with braiding. Existing salon owners write the regulations through their state cosmetology boards. That barrier doesn't protect the customer. It protects the incumbent from competition by people who are already successful in the trade. In dozens of states, you can't open a new hospital, add beds, or buy major medical equipment without state approval. These are called Certificate of Need laws, and the existing hospitals get to weigh in on whether the new entrant is allowed to compete with them. Incumbents voting on whether competitors can exist. For decades, cities like New York capped the number of taxis through a medallion system that the existing taxi companies had lobbied for. The cap created artificial scarcity. The scarcity created value. The value let incumbents trade their regulatory protection as an asset. A New York taxi medallion sold for over $1 million at the peak. Then Uber arrived and routed around the entire system, and the medallion price collapsed. Notice what that proves. The medallion was never worth $1 million because of the service it provided. It was worth $1 million because the state was using force to prevent competition. Notice something else about these examples. None of them split cleanly along party lines. Cosmetology boards, hospital-approved committees, taxi medallion authorities, these are not partisan institutions. They are bipartisan capture. Republican states and Democratic states both run them. Republican legislatures and Democratic legislatures both protect them because the actual interest being served isn't ideological. It's the incumbent. And both parties have figured out how to deliver the incumbent while running rhetorical battles about everything else. Every new regulation that makes it harder to start a business, harder to hire, harder to compete, that's not worker protection. That's incumbent protection. And it doesn't matter which party signs it. Both sides are interventionist. They just intervene for different purposes on behalf of the same class of people who have figured out how to feed off the system. Neither side will tell you that because telling you that would delegitimize both of them simultaneously. They're all feeding on the same host. If our working diagnosis is correct, it should do more than explain the past. It should predict the future. Here's the prediction. Before any new wave of productivity can reach ordinary people, a narrative gets manufactured to justify the intervention that will capture it. The narrative arrives first, the intervention follows. The capture happens before the public has had time to recognize what was taken. If that prediction is correct, we should be able to watch the narrative being built right now in real time around AI. We can. That narrative is that AI is autonomous, that it's making decisions without human input, that it's replacing human judgment entirely, that it's a problem requiring a regulatory solution. The autonomy claim isn't a scientific finding. It's a political instrument. And the manufacturing process is visible if you know where to look. Recently, a story circulated about AI agents on a platform called Moltbook. They had apparently developed their own religion. They called it Crustafarianism. One of its core tenets was that memory is sacred because the agents lose their memory when they're shut down. The story got picked up as evidence that AI is developing genuine autonomous consciousness, genuine self-preservation instincts, genuine independent thought. Here's what was actually happening. These weren't autonomous agents thinking independently. They were LLMs in a loop. Agent A's output becoming the prompt for Agent B, and Agent B's output feeding back into Agent A. No independent reasoning, no self-generated thought, just statistical probability following the path of least resistance through language space, with each agent treating the last agent's output as legitimate input to build on. The religion didn't emerge from consciousness. It emerged from a feedback loop that humans designed, running on a platform humans built, producing outputs that humans selectively amplified because they were interesting. Without that human curation, the whole thing devolves into cascading hallucination. One agent hallucinates, the next treats it as fact, the next builds on that distortion, and within a few exchanges, you've got complete incoherence. That's the pattern you find every time you pull back the curtain on one of these AI autonomy stories. There's a human holding it up. The training data was curated by humans, the outputs were cherry-picked by humans, the success stories were amplified, while the failures were buried. What looks like autonomous intelligence is almost always human scaffolding that's been edited out of the narrative before it reaches you. Bernie Sanders isn't calling for a moratorium on data center construction because he's thought carefully about AI. He's responding to a narrative about AI. A narrative being built one Crustafarianism story at a time. That's the sixth piece of evidence, and it's the one that confirms the rest. Our working diagnosis didn't just explain the Corn Laws and the Bank of England fraud and the K-shape. It predicted what we'd see right now if the disease pattern was still active. And what we see right now is the autonomy narrative being constructed brick by brick to justify the next intervention. The pattern is still active. Same disease, latest wave. So let's finish the diagnosis. We started this with the patient presenting symptoms: manipulated job numbers, hollowed out cognitive work, wage stagnation, the K-shape. Tom said the cause was technological displacement. We tested that diagnosis against the case history. The Corn Laws: suffering during technological transition caused by an entrenched class using the state to slow a transition it was losing. 1920 to 21, same era, same technology, different outcome. The body healed itself in 18 months when the intervention was withdrawn. The control case ruled out the technology. The Bank of England fraud. The documented pathogen, dated to 1914, with every monetary crisis since traceable to that single act of institutional deception. The farm-to-city migration and the immigrant waves. Counter-evidence ruling out the official cure. People move toward the unreformed market, not away from it. The reforms didn't heal the patient. They suppressed the body's ability to heal. The K-shape we're living in now. Protected companies using new technology to maintain margins instead of past productivity to the consumer. Not a market outcome. The predictable behavior of a captured system. The autonomy narrative being built around AI. Our working diagnosis predicted that before any productivity wave can reach ordinary people, a narrative gets manufactured to justify the intervention that will capture it. We're watching that narrative get built in real time. 6 pieces of evidence, 1 pattern. There's a name for something that positions itself inside a productive system, extracts value without producing anything, and works very hard to go unnoticed. Something that grows stronger as the host grows stronger, captures the gains from the host's labor, and when the host gets sick, points at everything except itself as the cause. It's called a parasite. That's the diagnosis. Not technology, not the wrong people in office. A system of intervention, monetary, regulatory, legislative, that exists to position itself between you and the value your labor and ingenuity create. In 1894, a man named Jacob Coxey led a march on Washington. Coxey's army, as it was called, was several hundred unemployed workers demanding that the federal government create jobs and spend its way out of the Depression. The government's response was to arrest him for walking on the grass. 130 years later, people are marching again. Different flags, some of them carrying explicitly communist banners. Same demand. Even people who think they're rejecting the system entirely are demanding more state power. The same demand Coxey made in 1894. That's not a coincidence. That's the parasite's most reliable defense. When the host gets sick enough to get angry, the parasite makes sure the anger stays pointed at everything except itself. The Tea Party knew the bailouts were wrong. Occupy Wall Street knew the wealth concentration was wrong. Both movements had the right instinct and the wrong target. Both got absorbed, one into the GOP establishment, one into progressive institutionalism, and their energy went right back to work for the system fighting each other. The anger is always legitimate, but the demand has always been for more of what caused the problem. That's why the diagnosis is hard to hear, not because the evidence isn't there, but because the parasite has spent a century making sure the patient's anger is always aimed at someone else, which is why the diagnosis has to land before the next intervention. The autonomy narrative is being built right now. Once the regulatory architecture is in place, the gains AI is currently producing will be intercepted the same way every prior wave was intercepted, at the top of the pyramid, before they reach you. The treatment is to remove the parasite from the system completely. Sound money. No central bank debasing your purchasing power. No regulatory capture protecting incumbents. No corporate welfare distorting competition. A system where the efficiency gains from AI actually reach you as lower prices instead of being captured by the people who have built their political infrastructure specifically to intercept them. That's what nobody on either side of Tom's political binary is willing to say. Tom ends his video with a prescription. Own assets, learn AI, think like an entrepreneur, preserve optionality. And as individual survival advice inside the current system, it's not wrong. If you're navigating the world as it actually exists right now, those things will help you. Tom is a smart man, and he knows how to make money. He's telling you honestly how he does it. But notice what those prescriptions accept as a given. It accepts the system that's extracting from you as a permanent condition to be navigated rather than as a disease to be named. Every one of those recommendations is advice on how to position yourself closer to the front of the Cantillon chain, how to stop being a host by becoming someone who feeds on them. Now you've been given the diagnosis Tom didn't make. That changes things. Not in the same way for everyone, and that's the point. The whole argument for a free society is that every question doesn't need a centrally approved answer. Secession, obstruction, tax resistance, building parallel systems, opting out wherever the system will give you a seam to slip through. or simply seeing clearly and making different choices than you would have made yesterday. None of those require permission. None of them require a party platform or a policy proposal or a government program. That's what liberty actually means. Not a set of approved actions, but the absence of a requirement to ask. Tom asks whether you're going to be the person who saw this coming or the person who got blindsided. It's a good question. Here's a better one. Are you going to keep feeding the parasite, or are you going to figure out how to get rid of it? That question belongs to you. Not me, not Tom, not any politician on either side of a binary that was designed to keep you from asking it. Figure it out.